Welcome to the Mind of Business Success podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Cramer. I have a special guest with us today. Doug is amazing. If you haven't seen my interview with him on Uplift Conversations with Visionaries, make sure you go and watch that after you're done listening to this episode. Doug is a treat. I am so excited to have you with us today. Doug, you are going to school us on some revolutionary concepts. Let's start by talking a little bit about this incredible finding. I'm going to call it a finding because you really
Yeah,
have
it's a finding.
it's a finding, right?
Yeah, it's a series of findings.
It's a
I guess
series
is
of
what it is.
findings that has culminated into an incredible book, an incredible software. Let's start there. Let's give our listeners are like, "Ooh, what is this? I want to know what this is. Sounds fascinating."
Yeah, well, a little background on me. I went to school and got a degree in economics, but I never quite believed all what was taught to me. And even before that, I learned about plotting systems back in, high school and things like that. And I always thought the plotting systems were lacking something. So I, after listening very carefully to my wife buying a washing machine of all things, I figured out that she was buying it in 4 dimensions. And what I realized after that was I went home and I started to figure out a way to plot in 4 dimensions. And it sounds complicated, but it's really nothing more than just a T with every dimension off of the T going in a different direction. It's nothing more than a T with points on either side of the T. And what I discovered was, very importantly, that the law of supply and demand that says there's only one equilibrium point in a market, well, that works for something like iron ore or gold or oil of a certain grade. But what it doesn't work for is the things that, say, iron goes into. It doesn't work for cars. And it turns out that what happens is people buy products in ways that you can predict it, which is to say people self-organize their behaviors. And so this whole study of hypernomics is the study of how people self-organize their behaviors, self-limit their buys, and create opportunities for those that can interpret those limits and those organized buys. And that's kind of what the whole concept of hypernomics is to be able to find these open spaces that people can thrive in.
So, in a really practical sense, what we're talking about here is the ability to know sort of in advance whether or not your product is going to be profitable, whether this is going to be successful or not, whether the market would actually want that. I know you get into pricing as well, determining
Yes.
pricing. Let's go a little bit deeper on this.
Okay, sure.
I want to just take into consideration that we have a very wide range of entrepreneurs who are
Mm-hmm.
listening. We have
Sure.
individuals who are service provider, perhaps they are a solopreneur and they're just simply selling their coaching services or their consulting
Mm-hmm.
services. We also have CEO founders of large corporations who are listening. So when we're talking about how this can apply to the average business owner, I know that is a very general approach to explaining this. Let's take a crack at it.
Oh, okay.
I'd love to help our audience see how this is applicable to them.
Well, great. Sure. Yeah, Alicia, I actually have a couple of great examples that happened during COVID right here in my little hometown of Santa Clarita, California. So we have a couple of places we like to go, and one of them is just down the street. COVID hit, and it hit here in California in the well, everywhere. It hit in early 2020, and so in California, it's warm enough you can eat outside if you have some heaters, typically. And so the restaurant we were going to have seats for over 100 inside, but its little patio areas held just a fraction of that. And so my wife would go down and I would go down to try to get a seat at the restaurant, and the line was going out the door as a popular place. So finally, one day after a couple of weeks had passed, I came up to the owner, or I should say the manager. I said, Kayla, would you like to make more money in this place? And she said, well, sure, Doug. Why wouldn't I? I said, well, are you amenable to doing a little furniture rearrangement? She goes, furniture rearrangement? What do you mean? I said, well, what you've got here in this little patio is you've got 3 tables of 6 and 3 tables of 4 and only a couple of tables for 2. Now, it works out, having been at your restaurant for a long, long time, and I turned out I actually had studied this offline too, that there's more than twice as many parties of 2 people going to the restaurant. There's twice as many parties of 2, more than twice as many parties of 2 as there are of 4, and even more so than 6. So I said, what you need to do is you need to take out some of the tables for 6 and tables for 4 and push in tables for 2. And so she did that, and her revenue shot up 25% in 2 months. Now, at the same time, in the same town, going the other direction, we had another place that we go to. And this place has had and still has picnic tables out back in this patio, trying to have a family environment there. And the owner had this rule that only parties of 6 or more could go into a picnic table. So it's COVID and people are trying to eat, and it's outside, so people are attracted to it. It's a fairly big patio. But what happened was he had all these open picnic tables, and there was 3 groups of 2 outside the door waiting to get in. And it turns out that the chance of having 3 parties of 6 or more come in to replace the 3 parties of 2 is kind of like hitting one number on roulette twice in a row. It's simply not going to happen. And they didn't know that. And they were acting as if they knew the best method to get people in the door, and it wasn't the best method to get in the door. Now, they didn't go bankrupt. They got pretty close to that. But part of the reason is that they didn't, and I was telling them what they needed to do. I actually showed them a map and told them what they needed to do, and they just blew it off. And the place down the street did better, and their revenue kind of fell off because they didn't listen. So this is real world stuff that you can do at a pretty basic level in some cases. And that's kind of what we start with. We start with the most basic cases and we try to grow it from there.
So I love these examples. They're so tangible. Anybody can really process it. It makes sense. But now, for someone who is looking at their business and they say, okay, maybe I want to improve this part of my business. How do I go about actually sort of plugging in these numbers and figuring these things out? Is there a formula?
Well, it turns out that every market creates its own series of formulas that describe how it behaves. And that's kind of what our software is designed to do. It's designed to take big globs of data, you condition it to go into the software, and then it shakes it out and tells you how the market is responding to the features that are offered it and what its limits are. So when I say the features that are offered it, so for example, an electric car, for example, people pay more for added horsepower and they pay more for range. And it turns out you can describe both of those phenomena at the same time with a plane that goes through all the data. And that's kind of what the software is trying to do. Is trying to minimize the errors between what people buy and what the average is, and then figure out how people should price new things. And if they already are in the market, say for example, if they're underpriced, it will suggest the optimal price for them. If they're overpriced, it'll tell them what will happen because there's a demand curve that goes along with it. It'll tell them what will happen if they drop the price, and often they'll make more money. And so what people are doing is they're basically flailing around in the dark, not understanding these relationships. So a Dr. Clayton Christensen out of Harvard University has said that, to your point about making new products, he says that 95% of all new product ideas fail, which is another way of saying 5% succeed. So what it's our hope is that we take the 5% that we have now, and then by increments, we start to improve that. So if you go from 5% to 6%, well, that's actually a 20% improvement. And so what we're hoping to do is people will start to use the software to see how they can improve their product. So for example, when it comes to product improvement, Elon Musk, he started out with the Teslas and they had like 300 horsepower at the beginning or 400. And then he went all the way up to 1,000. And for a period of time, there wasn't anything in between, say, 700, 800, 1,000 like he had. And the lower end cars that were down in the 200 and 300 zone. And then he came back and he put in some cars that were in between, and they've done really well for him. In fact, the Tesla Model 3 is, I believe, the most popular car in California right now for new car sales. So it's an idea of trying to figure out what the market wants, doesn't have, and can afford. That's what the software is trying to do for you, is to try to drill your way into those spaces. And sometimes they're pretty dramatic, these spaces. You can actually find them pretty easily. So in the electric car case, it turned out that in 2013, there weren't any cars between about $35,000 and $60,000. So that's a big range of cars that have now since filled that gap. And there weren't any cars that had, as I said, the 300 horsepower or 300 miles of range, except for the couple of the Teslas. And so if you could have put something in that slot before other people got there, you would have something that by analysis people wanted and would buy, but nobody was building it. And that's kind of what this is trying to do, is to try to drive you into these open spaces to figure out what to build.
And who wouldn't want to have that ability to know exactly where the gap is in the market that you can fill? I mean, we are oversaturated. It really is. I mean, we're over consumers, and there's
Yes.
no shortage of new businesses that are entering the market, offering more of the same of what there already is an abundance of, in some cases, an
Right.
overabundance of. And it makes it incredibly difficult for a business owner to gain traction in an oversaturated market, to have that ability to see where there is a gap and to be the one to fill that gap is almost like having a superpower.
Yeah, it's exactly like that, Alicia. And so for one of the other small businesses we're working on right now is there's a company up in the Pacific Northwest that's building a small, what they call a teardrop trailer. You may have seen them before. They kind of looks like a teardrop from the side. And everybody else that makes teardrop trailers makes them out of wood or plywood or fiberglass or a combination of both. And then you can take a step up and go to the Airstreams, which are these all aluminum devices that you see around. But nobody's got anything really in between, or would anything that would be better. Well, this guy, he works with composite materials. That's the same thing they put on fighter jets. That's the same thing they put on the Boeing 787. So he's building himself a trailer out of composites that's so light that it basically, when you build a brand new trailer, there's a full quarter of the cars on the road right now that can't carry a trailer because they don't have the hitch weight for it. They don't have the pulling power. His thing is small enough that the smallest cars can, well, nearly most of the smaller cars can carry this trailer, and it's very maneuverable, and it's going to be more durable than aluminum. And so he's found this gap in the market. He's taken a new material, same product form, but he's got a new material, and it's going to basically drop weight, which turns out to be a feature that people want, and then he'll be able to sell more of these devices. So he kind of just, he did do the analysis here by himself to figure out the open space. Now he's employing us to figure out the right price and to show why it's a good deal. So that's kind of what we're up to.
Now, you are rocking the boat a little bit, and I'd like to talk about that for a moment. As entrepreneurs, many of us are pushing the status quo.
True.
We are
That's
the
very
boat
true.
rockers.
Right.
So, for an individual like yourself who has something that really is quite innovative, cutting edge, leading edge,
Hmm.
I'm sure there is some skepticism and some pushback.
Oh,
And
sure.
I'd like to get into that. This is a little bit more of the mindset side of things,
Sure.
because I know that it can be challenging. Business in and of itself is challenging, right?
Right.
We're dealing with some pretty substantial learning curves. We are pushing beyond our old comfort zone.
Oh, sure.
We are full of beliefs that are not congruent with our goals. And
Right.
so to be out there, putting your work out into the world, having to sort of present this concept that might be foreign to some, might feel a little
Hmm.
intimidating even to some. Um, how has that journey been for you?
Oh, it's been, we've gotten more than our fair share of pushback, Alicia, that's for sure. And so we've been challenged at numerous turns to say, well, how can you prove that it works? Can you give us an all-encompassing, ubiquitous example? So one of my friends challenged us. I mean, the company's been up for 12 years. So just a little over 4 years ago, we decided to put together, I mean, using my money, and it's not open for sale. So I have to emphasize that so I don't get in trouble with the SEC. I'm not talking the Southeast Football Conference. I'm talking the Securities and Exchange Commission.
The
That
fun
SEC.
one that every business owner loves.
Right. That one. Yeah. So what we decided to do is we decided to see if we could put together a fund that would outperform the S&P 500, only pulling stocks from the S&P 500. And so 2 weeks ago, we went for, after 50 months, we went from our index, we indexed us and the S&P 500 and Berkshire Hathaway all to one. And we reached two before the S&P 500 did. In fact, we were 1.9 times what they've done over 50 months. And we were 1.2 times what Berkshire Hathaway with their 400,000 people was doing over the same period. So one of the ways to get around the pushback is saying, well, if you don't believe that it works, it shouldn't work in anything. And if it works in the stock market, that might suggest to you that it does work and probably will work in every environment. So we've seen it works for everything from, like we like to say, from ground beef to train travel to spaceships. And we've applied it to all those markets, and it always works. It won't work, again, for the single feature commodities like the iron ore that we're talking about, or 24 karat gold, or crude oil, but everything else it works for. So that's why we've experienced some pushback from some people, and so in order to make the point that it works, just yesterday I put out a post on my LinkedIn file, which I don't know if your listeners know what the B-21 bomber is by Northrop Grumman, but there's this new stealth bomber that's going to replace the B-2 and the B-1 bombers. And so I basically wrote that the premature end of the B-21, which is to say they want to buy 100 by 2039. And I basically showed that they have less than a 1 in a million chance of buying 100 because there's a limit, that frontier that I was talking about. That frontier is formed. It is, as we say in math, very highly correlated. And they want to be way past the frontier. And I'm saying that's not going to happen. And so nobody's telling me I'm wrong, but a few people don't want to hear the story. So, but yeah, we get pushed back from a lot of areas. And so, I went to, I'm here in Southern California, and I went to a very large, internationally known university here. And the Extension University wants to give me a class, and I'll eventually have a class through that. But I tried to go to the graduate school proper. And I was basically tossed out on my ear. I was in one guy's office. He refused to read the book. Another guy refused to talk about it. But just recently, the book that we'll talk about in a little bit, the book was reviewed and by a colonel from the Air Force, and just recommended it to the United States Air Force Institute of Technology, which is the Air Force graduate school. That's where people from the Air Force Academy go to get an advanced degree. So, it's taken a while, and it's very different. When you talk to people about starting in 4 dimensions and going from there, they kind of, a lot of people kind of freak out. But it turns out that what I like to reassure people is that it takes behaviors you already know. It takes behaviors you already know and basically characterizes them in ways in which you've never seen before, but need to know. And that's kind of the whole point of it. So that's where we know we're going to eventually rule the day. People won't be able to, I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years down the road, you won't be able to go to university and be in a business or econ environment without being exposed to hypernomics. It simply won't be allowed. You'll have to know what this is. So I'm not certain of it because it's always worked. That's why it's taken me. I've been out of I've been out of my full-time job now for 13 years. It's taken me that long to get all the background information. 13 published peer-reviewed papers, a U.S. patent, the book, and then clients like NASA, Lockheed Martin, Virgin Galactic. Those tend to put a stamp of approval on you after a certain period of time. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to convey that to the masses now. So that's our goal right now, is to show it to everybody, because obviously it aggrandizes the company, but this is going to help the world economy out. For example, back in 2020, when COVID hit, a very underreported phenomenon was that the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank took the primary money supply, which they call M1, took the primary money supply, which had been growing gradually for decades. They took it up by 400%, 4x in 2 quarters. And now we're screaming about inflation 4 years later. Well, why did that happen? Let's go back to that 400% increase in the money supply. And it turns out that hypernomics can explain how currencies work too. But you have to employ it and recognize what the signals that it's giving you in order to benefit from the analyses. So that's what we're trying to convey to people. It's going to help all manner of problems. The same thing happens with taxation. In taxation, in 2014, the state of Colorado and the state of Washington both legalized recreational marijuana. Now, Washington state has more people than Colorado, but at the end of the year, Colorado had $350 million in recreational marijuana taxes, and Washington state had 50. Why was that? Well, it turns out there's a demand curve for recreational marijuana. And it turns out that demand curve is pretty flat, which means that Washington state had a 108% tax. I'm not joking, 108% tax on marijuana. And Colorado had roughly a 30% tax. And basically, Washington state might as well taken a gun at and just shot their foot off, because they didn't understand that there was a flat curve for the recreational marijuana. And this kind of helps you uncover all this stuff so that you don't make these mistakes going forward. Now, to their credit, Washington state eventually did drop the tax rate and made more money, but that's only after they had this disaster that was 2014. So it's designed to try to have people avoid making those kinds of mistakes as frequently as we do as a society right now.
This is a great opportunity for me to just remind everyone why I hyped you up so much at the beginning of the episode. In my opinion, you really are the quintessential visionary. When we think of visionaries, we looked at somebody like Elon Musk, who is, a billionaire, and he's all over the place, and he's obviously created a pretty large presence. But there are all of these other incredible individuals like yourself who are leaders and innovators, and I'm always preaching the importance of mindset and persistence. And, you know, you're not going to necessarily knock it out of the park when
Right.
you first start a business. And to have that type of vision and to be able to sustain the pushback and the hard knocks, the getting knocked down and picking yourself up, and knowing that the vision is worth the persistence. The vision is worth the effort. It's worth, showing up every day and doing what you feel called to do. And so I just wanted to take a moment and sort of shine the light on that, because there probably are a lot of people who are listening who might be in their first 13 years, right? You said it's been 13 years. They might
13
still
years,
be,
yeah.
they might be in year number 2 or year number 7 and still be like, okay, well, I'm doing all this stuff.
Hmm.
When is it going to be my time? And it is your time, and every year was your year. You were just building, 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 building all of that time.
Yeah, I remember a friend of mine telling me, after I've been at it about 7 or 8 years, and by the way, I left a nice cushy six-figure job and a very nice 401k that I depleted to fund this company. I left on a 1 5-figure contract, and haven't looked back since. But this friend of mine was telling me about the Beatles. The Beatles came to America, and I think it was '64, and it was Beatlemania, and everybody was going, "Wow, what an overnight success!" But they didn't realize that these guys had been playing in pubs in England and Germany for, I think it was 7 or 8 years before they hit it big. And overnight successes are rare. It's more likely to be able to push real hard for a long period of time. And then finally, a bunch of people start to see it. And then there's that ramp up period, which I hope we're hitting right now. And then the world kind of catches on. That's kind of what we're hoping for, is that the world will catch on. But the great thing about math, as opposed to what everybody else is working on, the math is either right or it's wrong. I've got only a bachelor's degree, but you know what? The math is right. I don't need to be a PhD to tell the PhDs, your math is wrong. You need to do this. And that's the great thing about mathematics. The math doesn't care where the math came from. And so that's what lets us say with confidence what we're doing is right and what people need to change. So that's how we look at it.
Let's talk about the book for just a moment.
Okay.
Can you give sort of a high level overview of the book? Because I want to make sure that our listeners know they can go deep on this
Yes.
subject in the
Okay.
book.
Yeah, the book is entitled Hypernomics: Using Hidden Dimensions to Solve Unseen Problems. And again, when I was telling you about that problem with the marijuana revenues, they didn't understand they had a problem there. So they didn't understand the dimensions that would have helped them solve the problems. So the book starts out with Hansel and Gretel. Why do I do that? Well, Hansel and Gretel famously went into the woods and wanted to find their way back home after they were dropped off by their uncaring parents. And they found their way home, the story goes, with some very bright pebbles that they left down. And what a pebble represents is it's a little dot that creates a map. And so they created a dot map, Hansel and Gretel did, for themselves. And all hypernomics is a series of gathering these dots. So if I told you 2 words to sum up the book, it's dot plots. We're showing where these dots are and making sense of that. And so we start out with a little simple dot plot, then we go to showing you how demand works in 2D, and then we show you how value, works in 3D, which is how what something's worth based on its features. And then we realize that demand and value have the same axis, so we get a 4-dimensional system. And then we eventually realize that other things have the same price axis. And the book takes you all the way up to a 16D system. And I'm very proud to say that it's written at a grade 11 level. And the one that recommended to the Air Force says, hey, it's an easy read. These are complicated ideas made simple on purpose so that people could grasp them. I didn't want to write over anybody's head. This is written in the way I would want to understand it when I was coming out of high school. It's written for late high school people, early college people that want to understand how things really work. And it shows you how to do it in a step-by-step process so that you just don't get lost in the movements of all of these different attributes.
I'm going to just encourage everyone to check out the book. It is available on Amazon and on your website, correct?
Yeah, Amazon, our website, which is hypernomics.com, hypernomics.com. And it's also available on Barnes and Noble and on the Wiley website, Wiley and Sons. That's my publisher.
Is there anywhere else you would like to direct our listeners to connect with you?
Well, I do have my personal website, doughowarth.com, so you could drop me a note there. I'm more often on the company website, so you could go to info@hypernomics.com, and we'll answer anything that you want to know there. So info@hypernomics.com would be great if you want to get a hold of me.
I have to thank you, Doug. Always a pleasure connecting with you.
Great.
Remember the first time I saw your information come through my inbox for Uplift, I'm thinking to myself, this is fascinating. Am I going to be able to understand what he's talking about? And you are so good at breaking down the complexity and putting it into conceptual terms that the average person can really grasp and understand. And you really do have a gift. And I'm grateful to be able to share you on my platform with my audiences and just be a small piece of you getting that traction and getting out there in a bigger way.
Well, thank you so much, Alicia, for having me on. Listeners, we were together on our other show, and it was fabulous. So I'm really lucky to be on the show, or on our shows twice. So thanks again, Alicia. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I'm going to thank all of our listeners as well. You know, we're doing this for you. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do so. And until next time, we will see you in the next episode.